Somebody once told me that all roads lead to Rome. On your character sheet, all roads lead to your ability scores or your proficiency. Let's go through the different things that might be on your character sheet. What do you do if you strike? You roll a d20 and you add your attack modifier. If you hit, you know you'll roll damage dice plus a damage modifier. If you get a critical hit, then you'll want to write down what damage dice you roll for a critical hit and your critical damage modifier. If you're striking, it means you're probably in combat, which means you'll want to know your AC, your current HP, your max HP, and whether you're dying or wounded. You might also want to stride, in which case you'll need to know your move speed. Often initiative is rolled with a d20 plus your perception modifier. You might want to use some of your skills if you want to jump or aid an ally. We could just write down a few examples. And if you're a spellcaster, you'll need your spell attack modifier and your spell DC. What if somebody wants to cast a spell on you? You'll have to roll a d20 and add your saving throw modifiers. There are also cases where you might need each of these numbers in a DC form, so we'll write that down as well. Seems like a lot of stuff already, but I'd like to point something out. Everything that requires you to roll a d20 has a modifier, and these modifiers take the same form. Likewise, everything on your character sheet that is a DC is calculated in the same way. You just have to add 10 to make it a DC. Your dying and wounded values, we'll ignore them for now. Then you'll need to know your damage dice and damage modifiers for your attacks. These are dependent on the weapon. Finally, you have your HP and move speed. We'll get to that later. For now, let's talk about these d20 rolls plus a modifier. All of these take the same form. A d20 roll plus a relevant ability modifier plus your proficiency in that task. If you want to turn it into a DC, you simply add 10. Then you have the same number as a DC. What are ability scores? Well, you have 6. Strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Your character will have a score associated with each of these abilities. These scores are then used to calculate your ability modifiers. Once you calculate your modifiers, you pretty much never need to know your ability scores again. Let's say you wanted to do a performance, and then you wanted to lie about it. Well, both of these tasks require a d20 roll plus the relevant ability modifier. In this case, is charisma. But that might seem strange. If your character is a very proficient trumpet player, that doesn't necessarily mean they're also good at lying. As part of your character, they'll have a list of things they're proficient in. This proficiency can have 5 levels: untrained, trained, expert, master, and legendary. Anything higher than untrained, you'll add your level. That means every time you level up, you become more proficient at things you're trained in. You can also see that each proficiency level has an increasing fixed bonus as well. So someone who's an expert trumpet player will do better at someone who's a trained trumpet player, even if they're the same level. Let's say you want to do a backflip. You have to make a relevant skill roll. In this case, probably acrobatics. We now know that your modifiers are made up of your ability scores plus your proficiency. What's the relevant ability score for acrobatics? Dexterity. And what is your proficiency in acrobatics? You're trained in acrobatics, but this will depend on your character. Therefore, we can replace your modifiers with your dexterity modifier plus your trained proficiency modifier. You might want to ask how you know what is the relevant ability score modifier for a given task. It's actually written on your character sheet. When you tell your GM you want to do a backflip, he'll tell you to make an acrobatics roll. You can then see all the components that make up your acrobatics modifier. Here's your ability score modifier. It even says Dex at the top. Here you have a space where you can fill out a little box. T for trained, E for expert, M for master, and L for legendary. If you look to the left of that box, then there's another place where you can write the actual number for your proficiency modifier. Then finally, you can add it all up and put the final number here. All d20 rolls on your character sheet will have these boxes for you to fill out. Now let's look at a strike, specifically melee strikes. Like all d20 rolls, we use the same formula. d20 plus the ability modifier plus proficiency. In this video, we'll mostly talk about melee weapons. That means the ability modifier will be strength. Of course, remember the multiple attack penalty. For your second attack, but you'll have to subtract 5. For your third attack, you'll have to subtract 10. If you hit with an attack, you'll need to know your damage, which will equal the weapon damage plus strength. If you get a critical hit, in most cases, multiply it by 2. This only applies to melee weapons. Ranged weapons do not add strength or dexterity to your weapon damage. Let's say you're trying to decide between a rapier and a dagger. The rapier has a damage die of 1d6. It's in the sword group, and it has the following traits: deadly d8, disarm, and finesse. The dagger has a damage die of 1d4. It's in the knife group, and it has the following traits: agile, finesse, thrown 10 feet, versatile S. Well, we can easily calculate how much damage you do on a hit with these damage die. But what do these traits mean? There are a lot of weapon traits, but in this video we'll talk about deadly d8, finesse, and agile. What's deadly d8? It means you add this amount of damage on a critical hit. after you double the damage. You could also have something else like deadly D10, in which case you would add a D10. Finesse. A finesse weapon means you can use your dexterity instead of strength for an attack roll, not the damage roll, just the attack roll. An agile weapon. This means your multiple attack penalty is -4 and -8 instead of -5 and -10. Let's see what things would look like if we use a rapier. We know that a rapier does 1d6, so damage will be 1d6 plus strength, and damage on critical will be times 2. But remember, the rapier has the deadly d8 trait, which means on a critical, you'll add an extra d8. A rapier is also a finesse weapon. That means we can use dexterity for our attack modifier. Let's look at the other weapon, the dagger. First, we'll replace the weapon damage with the damage die from the dagger. Now let's check out the traits. Dagger is also a finesse weapon, so we can use dexterity instead of strength. A dagger also has the agile property. That means instead of a -5 and a -10 penalty for multiple attacks, it's only a -4 and a -8. The other thing that's very important to look at is the weapon group. For example, all knives add 1d6 persistent bleed damage on an attack. Let's look at the remaining things on our tiny character sheet. You might have heard people talk about your ABCs, your ancestry, your background, and your class. Well, let's make some connections between these two things. Ability scores come from your ancestry. They also come from your background. Your class will give you a bunch of proficiencies. Your class will also give you a key ability score, which will then give you a bonus to your ability scores. You also have a move speed and a maximum hit points. Your ancestry contributes to both. It will give you your move speed and your max hit points. Your class will also give you more max hit points. Your key ability score is just the most important ability score for your class. This could give you something called the class DC. Again, the same formula as we've seen 1,000 times. How do we calculate our spell attack modifier and spell DC? The answer is your spellcaster's ability score. Now we've covered everything on our tiny character sheet.